Hi there, my name is James Boston. I'm the founder of the Association of Former British Colonies. The association's aim is to examine the legacies of British colonisation with a view to informing global and UK policy change around reparations and decolonisation. Today, I am joined by Laura Trevelyan to explore the legacies of British slave ownership in more detail. Thank you very much for joining us today, Laura. It would be great if you could introduce yourselves for our audience, please.
Thanks so much for the invitation, James. It's great to be with you, and hello to your audience. I would like to credit James for this very important initiative that he set up here, because there's so much to discuss. And I think it's so exciting that you're young, James, and that you're leading the conversation on this important area. So yes, I'm Laura Trevelyan. I was a BBC journalist for 30 years. I left the BBC earlier this year because in February of this year, that's 2023, I went with members of my family to Grenada in the Caribbean, small island in the West Indies, 120,000 people. And we actually went there to apologize for the role of our ancestors in enslaving the ancestors of the people of Grenada. And this was something that we had found out about, well, certainly me, sometime around 2016 after University College London produced their database of legacies of British slavery. I made a documentary about the fact for the BBC about the fact my ancestors had been enslavers there, and asked Grenadians about the legacies of slavery and learnt about the reparations debate. And after we went to Grenada in February and apologized for what our ancestors had done, the reaction to it was so overwhelming that I felt there was perhaps more that I might be able to do to help the Caribbean promote its reparatory justice agenda. So I left the BBC, and here we are today, James, having a chat about all of it.
No, thank you very much, Laura, and thank you for sharing that. It's very inspirational work that you're doing. Just a kind of segue, could you tell our audience about the name of the documentary in case people wanted to watch it and find it online?
Yeah, it's called Grenada, Confronting the Past. It came out in May 2022, and it's still on the BBC's YouTube channel. You can find it there. You can also download the podcast as well. There's a half-hour radio documentary version of it. So yes, the title is Grenada, Confronting the Past, and it features interviews with Grenadians, notably Nicole Phillip Dow, who's a historian and vice chair of Grenada's National Reparations Committee, and also Ali Gill, who's the chair of Grenada's National Reparations Committee. And through meeting those two and asking them if there was a role that I, as a descendant of enslavers, could play and what my moral responsibility was if I had one, that was the question I was really posing in Grenada. And Ali and Nicole said resoundingly, yes, you know, there is a responsibility here. There is something you can do. And if you could set an example with an apology and with a reparations strategy, then that would be important. And so I donated £100,000 of my own money to education funds in Grenada. And currently Grenada's National Reparations Committee is considering exactly where those funds would best be spent in Grenada.
Thank you. We've actually interviewed Ali on this platform, so it's also an interview people can check out. So I'm interested in kind of the journey, and I want to dig a bit deeper. So what was the initial inspiration? And I'm aware that you've also become a trustee on the Trevelyan Grenada Reparations Fund. So what was the initial, was there a specific point where you felt inspired to undertake this journey?
I think it unfolded over a period. It's a good question, James. I mean, I went to Grenada to film in February of 2022, but it was really Black Lives Matter here in the United States and the protests after the death of George Floyd, which of course went global. But here in New York City, where I live, where I'm talking to you from, there were protests every night about police brutality and racism. And as a BBC anchor covering these protests every night on the program that I was anchoring then, World News America, I just began to think really hard about something that I hadn't really thought about since 2016, when family members had said, oh, you know, we're in the University College London database, and it says that Trevelyans received compensation when slavery was abolished because of the plantations that our ancestors owed in Grenada. So I'd kind of parked that in the mental category of too difficult to deal with, although everybody in the family approached me because they said, oh, Laura, you're the journalist, you've written books. what are you going to do about this? And I didn't have a good answer. But then in 2020, I really had to think about it hard that summer. And so, of course, being a journalist and a reporter, my answer was, well, I need to go to Grenada. I need to find out what's happening there. How is Grenada approaching the question of slavery and the legacy? And if a legacy in America of slavery is police brutality towards Black men, what does it look like in Grenada? And so I went back and forth with my BBC bosses, and they said, well, Laura, if you make this documentary, you have to ask the question, should I pay reparations? That's an editorial condition for you going. You can't duck that. You can't just go, on a jolly to the Caribbean and swan around. You've got to ask the tough questions, as is the BBC tradition. Yeah, so I think it was, an unfolding journey, and I feel honoured now to say that I am an honorary associate fellow at the PJ Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies. Feel honoured to be considered worthy of that role, and yeah, a lot has happened.
And in terms of that role, and also the Trevelyan Grenada Reparations Fund, what are some of your aims? What do you hope to achieve? And also, what have you been able to achieve thus far?
Well, in terms of the aims, so we've just got permission from the Charities Commission in Britain to set up the Trevelyan Grenada Reparations Fund. And I'm one of several trustees with other family members. I don't know how much money that charity will be able to raise. It's primarily aimed at encouraging family to give, mostly small amounts. We've suggested people give £20 a month, but in a big family, that could add up. We had 104 family members signed our letter of apology to the people of Grenada that we worked on closely in collaboration with people at Grenada's Reparations Committee, and also with Sir Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, which is how I got privileged to get to know him. So the aim of that charity, what we said to the Charity Commission specifically, is to contribute to education in Grenada and the rest of the Caribbean. So it's quite broad, but our hope is that the University of the West Indies, for example, could be one source of money that we could give to in Grenada, bursaries, because there's an open campus for the University of the West Indies in Grenada, meaning a remote campus, essentially. And then also we have been giving money to a charitable organisation called Grenade in Grenada, which is situated in Grenville, and it helps rural children with the cost of their education, things like bus fares, which are super expensive, backpacks, when you're on an island and you import everything. These things can be incredibly expensive, just basic school supplies. So these are things that already we're funding individually. And in terms of the fellowship, I've discussed with Sir Hilary Beckles the idea of the Caribbean archives in Jamaica, Antigua, and Barbados, these key archives from the early period of slavery, which have plantation records, just details about who people are and where they came from. But these archives are on paper. Some of the documents are nearly 400 years old. They're not digitized. They're not available. And so Sir Hilary has the idea of there should be an online, universally available early slavery database that would be searchable, that would have educational materials. And that's something that I want to put my shoulder to the wheel to see if I can make it happen, to see if I can help raise money for it in the guise of being, in the role of being a fellow at PJ Patterson's Institute. Because if you think about it, and I talked to Sir Hilary about this, it could be a good role for someone who's an Africa Caribbean advocate, because the Barbados archive, Barbados is the easternmost island in the Caribbean. It was a straight shot from West Africa. That was where the enslaved Africans, thousands of people were brought. Barbados was like a staging post for slavery in British America, for South Carolina. So there's so much information that people are hungry for about who they are and where they came from. And if you think about how the UCL database showed people like me how our ancestors were compensated for unbelievably when slavery was abolished, the kind of information in these archives, if it was put online and had historical context and educational materials, I think it could be a hugely important resource.
I think I agree. It's something that we've discussed with another interview guest on our platform around the digitalization of records of enslavement. In the interview that I think that's with Melissa Ramnoth, the interview also looked at having kind of records of indentureship also digitalized as well, because the risk is with sort of natural disasters in the Caribbean, these records that are kind of currently on paper, the risk is they could be lost permanently, and then you've just completely lost history. Whether that's the possibility of finding out, who were the owners of plantations, but also the very slim possibility that someone like myself from an African Caribbean background may be able to find a trace of where their ancestors may have come from in Africa, for example. So these records are so crucial to kind of improving our understanding, and hopefully, in terms of repair and restoration and the work that you're doing, there can be that contribution. And kind of segueing onto that, my next question really wanted to talk about your work and advocacy around CARICOM's reparations movement. So how are you currently supporting that reparations mandate from CARICOM?
Well, anyone who asks me to talk about reparations, I say yes, and I talk about the CARICOM 10-point plan, because CARICOM has a very clear reparations plan and has had since 2014. And in a sense, our family used it as a guide for what we should do. Even though it wasn't designed for families who were descended from enslavers, the idea of CARICOM's 10-point plan is that the former colonial powers will sit down and engage and negotiate with CARICOM on the basis of this plan. But point number one on that 10-point plan is an apology. Then there are calls for investment in health and education, for debt relief. So we used that in conjunction with the guidance of Sir Hilary Beckles and Grenada's National Reparations Committee. We really used CARICOM's 10-point plan to figure out what we should do as a family to apologise and to invest in education. So that's one thing. Obviously, as an honorary associate fellow at PJ Patterson's Institute in the University of the West Indies, I also hope to be able to talk about reparatory justice whenever I can. And at the moment, I have a podcast which is out, which I'm presenting with the Labour MP Clive Lewis, called Heirs of Enslavement, where we're exploring the fact that we're linked potentially through the history of slavery in Grenada, that it's possible that Clive's ancestors were enslaved by mine. And we're asking, what does that mean? And we're talking about the CARICOM 10-point plan and asking, what elements of it could potentially be the basis for negotiation, maybe if there's a change of government in Britain in the next year. And we're also looking very specifically at climate change, which of course you mentioned there, you referenced in terms of the archives and how they're at risk in the Caribbean from a hurricane, how all this history could be lost, but also lives and livelihoods too are at risk in the Caribbean. And Clive and I are asking, is there a reparative element to climate resiliency funding, for example? Do the former colonial powers owe it to the Caribbean? And we're arguing, yes, they do, that there should be an important element to climate resiliency funding and a moral duty for the former colonial powers to invest in that. And, the Bridgetown Initiative in Barbados, which, although it's not presented as a reparative strategy, nonetheless, that's elements of that are being discussed this week at the COP28 summit, the idea that there should be a loss and damage fund, that, former colonial powers, the big industrial polluters, that they have a responsibility to help those countries who are most at risk because of historical actions.
Absolutely. And I have come across this research recently around the legacies of colonisation in terms of the environmental impacts. And it is a really important conversation to have. And I suppose as the research continues, obviously we're here talking about the legacies of enslavement and CARICOM's reparations plan, which also includes the indigenous genocide that took place in the Caribbean. The research will uncover more and more legacies, whether they're social, whether they're economic, whether they're political, whether they're in the legal system, whether they're in the environment. There are so many different layers to uncover. And I suppose this is why archivists and researchers have such a crucial role. But I suppose with the issues in the Caribbean around the environmental disasters that sort of take place every year. I mean, my family in Jamaica, unfortunately, part of their house was blown down this year. They just pose such a threat. And because of the legacies of the colonization from an economic point of view, Caribbean countries in many cases just simply don't have the resources and the financial base to address these issues. And I suppose that's where repair comes in, and the idea that former colonial powers should take responsibility for initiating these forms of repair. And I suppose that's a nice segue into the next conversation. So it's no secret that there has been pushback. You see it in certain forms of media. You see it from the British government in some cases, where there's a sort of direct refusal to have a conversation about reparatory justice. In your view, what can be done to change that, to engage British parliamentarians, decision makers, institutions, to get involved, to have conversations, and to undergo the kind of reparatory justice process that CARICOM are calling for?
Yeah, well, I think it's important that you call it a process there, James, because it's not something that's going to happen overnight, is it? No. You know, it's almost 400 years since the first planters showed up in Barbados and began to abuse the enslaved Africans. And we're only really just beginning to talk about that legacy now. So it's not going to happen overnight. But, you know, it's CARICOM's 10-point plan is only 10 years old, which is also, in a sense, shocking when you think about it, that it's taken this long for, you know, Caribbean nations to become independent. Most of them have been independent for 50, 60 years. Some, of course, are still British territories because they're too small to be able to function economically without the support of Britain. So it's a long, gradual conversation. It's taken us a long time to get to this point. But my hope is that a process of public education is underway now, that what happened in 2020 when the world was on pause because of the pandemic, and then the murder of George Floyd, brought attention to legacies of slavery in a way that nobody could have predicted. That's really turbocharged the conversation and prompted so many institutions to at least look at their pasts and their involvement in slavery. But as you say, this current British government has no interest in reparations. But I would note that the new Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, he's someone who, it was widely reported in 2015 that distant relatives of his were compensated when slavery was abolished for their links to slavery in Jamaica, which just shows you the extent to which in 19th century Britain there was this interweaving between the ruling classes and slavery, really. Yeah. So my hope is that this Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, when he was last in Jamaica in 2015, he said it was time to move on from the painful legacy. But I think you can see there is no moving on without acknowledgement and discussion. So my hope is that he would perhaps will approach it differently, and that if there is a change of government in Britain, the Foreign Secretary could be David Lammy, himself a child of the Caribbean. He's British Guyanese, somebody who was part of that Tony Blair government in 2001 at the Durban Anti-Racism Conference, where an opportunity was missed to talk about reparations, to pick up what the Caribbean wanted. And my hope is that a similar conference would have a different outcome now. And you see that the African Union is now backing the Caribbean's call for reparations, and indeed calling for reparations for Africa. What that looks like, we don't know. There was just the Accra conference where the Caribbean and the African Union joined together, a hugely significant diplomatic event. Where all of this is going, we don't know, but it's underway. So in answer to your question, keep talking, keep pushing.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned, I think now Lord Cameron, he's made a Lord recently, the comments he made when he was Prime Minister and he visited Jamaica around it's time to move on from slavery. And obviously, as you said, given his own family background, I think it left a very bitter taste. It did it certainly in my mouth as someone of Jamaican descent. It came across as out of touch. It also came across as kind of a sense of sort of in denial, where there was an unwillingness and an intentional unwillingness to acknowledge the damages that are still existent, and how it's not as straightforward as he kind of put it to just move on from slavery. In fact, quite the opposite, given the extent of the legacies, whether they're economic, social, environmental. These aren't things you can just kind of flick a switch and move forward from. They require specific reforms to repair and address. Yes, there are some of those legacies that can never be undone. For example, we can't undo the indigenous genocide in the Caribbean. What we can do, as you see in CARICOM's 10-point plan, is introduce an indigenous redevelopment program, for example, or an illiteracy eradication program that can at least begin the process of repair, which will be a very long journey. So yeah, it's very interesting observation. And also just to pick up on what you're saying around the sort of involvement of the African Union. Since starting the association and having conversations with people globally, whether they're from indigenous Australian backgrounds, South Asian backgrounds, African Caribbean backgrounds, Nigerian backgrounds, when you bring up this concept of reparations for colonization, it's very interesting that in some regions, it's something that's at the very forefront and there is political will there. And in other regions, there isn't political will, but there is amongst the grassroots. And that's really interesting as well. So I'm glad that you pointed that out. I just wanted to go into a bit more detail around perhaps your role and persons who... Hi, Laura, are you still there?
Yes, still there.
I lost you for a moment. I'll edit that bit out and start again. So I just wanted to pick up on your role, which was something you mentioned earlier around your role in driving forward and supporting CARICOM's reparations mandate. How do you feel that you've been able to influence the kind of, or should I say, support CARICOM's reparations mandate so far? And also for someone who may have a similar background to yourself in terms of, their ancestors may have been involved in the enslavement, in chattel slavery, how could they also get involved in supporting CARICOM's reparations mandate?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the way that I look at it is that I've really followed the lead of the Caribbean, that in going to Grenada to make the documentary for the BBC last year and asking, is there a responsibility of descendants of the enslavers here? And being told, yes, there is. Where have you been all these hundreds of years? We've been waiting for you to show up. So that's how I look at it, that it's a Caribbean-led process, that having been told by leaders in the reparative justice movement who've been working on this for years, unlike me, who, has just come to this realization very lately. So that's the way that I look at it, is that the Caribbean has a roadmap. The 10-point plan is a roadmap, which, although it's for governments, it equally well can apply to descendants of slave owners, as we've seen. And, leaders in the Caribbean have been so flexible, actually, in welcoming people like myself. And in August, I actually went to Guyana with Charles Gladstone and his family, and he's a descendant of John Gladstone, who the father of the 19th century English Prime Minister, William Gladstone. And John Gladstone was not only one of the biggest enslavers in Guyana and also in Jamaica, but also the intellectual architect of Indian indentureship after the abolition of slavery. And so Charlie Gladstone worked very hard with Guyana's Reparations Committee and the University of Guyana on an apology for the actions of his ancestor, which would encompass not only slavery, but also indentureship. So again, I think, if people are looking for what can they do, every Caribbean island in the British Caribbean has a reparations committee. People will be willing to talk to you. There's a role. It's easy to get in touch with people. It's easy to find people. Perhaps it can be difficult to corral your family into what should be done, and it's difficult to get agreement, especially in big families. I know that from myself, but I do think that it's important, if you can, to acknowledge this past, and I would encourage people to, and I would encourage them to reach out to the reparations committees in the Caribbean who are there with a roadmap for you.
Mm-hmm. And is there also a role in terms of engaging British parliamentarians on this issue?
Well, I mean, I think I have, through my links with the Labour MP Clive Lewis, who's chair of the British Caribbean Association. There are all-party parliamentary groups, various, dealing with reparations and with the issue. yes, there's definitely a role for sure. But I found myself, perhaps because I'm sitting here in New York and it's closer to the Caribbean than it is to Britain, that just going to the Caribbean, going to Jamaica, going to Guyana, going to Grenada, that I've learned so much. And, I was invited, for example, just recently by the Women's National Centre of Jamaica Foundation, which works with teen pregnancy. I was invited to make a documentary about their work, and the people in Jamaica, feminist scholars, will tell you that the family structure was destroyed by slavery, and that the high rate of teenage pregnancy, incest, the rape that exists, although it's rare, it still exists, that this is a legacy of the way that women were just treated as property sexually, and by the way, the complete destruction of the family unit under slavery, that these are legacies which are hard to talk about and to acknowledge. And yet, why is it that things are happening today which are really horrifying? So I guess there are, so many elements to all of it. But I would say to people, yes, there is a role for you if you're a descendant of an enslaver and if you're willing to engage there. And there are people that will want to talk to you about it.
I think it's really important, and I'm glad you've mentioned you've kind of there highlighted the importance of education. And I think I don't mind sharing this, that for myself, when I was 16, I first watched Roots for the first time. That was really a turning point for me. But I could immediately see that there were legacies even in the present moment of that history. And I think the thing that struck me most was the void that was established as a result of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans in terms of identity, that you don't see. You may see snippets of surviving African culture in the Caribbean, and not just the British Caribbean. You see perhaps more in the Spanish Caribbean islands in terms of the integration of kind of a lot of African words into how Spanish is spoken in Cuba, for example. But in terms of Jamaica, where my family's from, other than snippets, I really had to research to find out where the surviving African culture was so that I could then recognize it, because it's not visible. And upon visiting Jamaica many times and seeing family and traveling around the islands, the history isn't memorialized. And I suppose that's also part of CARICOM's reparations plan, that there isn't that, this was a plantation and it's almost in a museum and it's kind of memorialized, and there is that sense of acknowledgement as to this was a plantation and these sort of things happened there. And I think it is really important to commemorate that history, not just for people living in the Caribbean, but also for those who perhaps were born in Britain, born outside the Caribbean, but are of Caribbean descent, to then go and visit their family homes or their sort of grandparents' homes, and actually understand and contextualize that story that might be missing.
Right. And you make such an important point about the plantations, and should they be museums? Because the physical evidence of slavery is everywhere in the Caribbean. There are many of these plantations are thriving cocoa and rum plantations to this day. And I went, for example, to Drax Hall in Barbados, which is still in the ownership of the family of Sir Richard Drax, who's a Conservative MP. And for 400 years almost, the Draxes have been in Barbados owning sugarcane plantations. And it just struck me that Drax Hall, which is this incredibly imposing stone building, that this is somewhere that really could be an incredible museum and a memorial to the enslaved, and a place of education, as you say, because there's so much tourism in the Caribbean. And I feel certain that visitors would like to know more about the history. And I understand why maybe the Caribbean has shrunk from it, because you don't want to put off tourism when this is, this is how you're making your money. You don't want to remind people of the unpleasant past. But I think it's long enough ago that we can acknowledge it and confront it and talk about it more dispassionately, maybe. And I know there's talk in Barbados of creating a national museum and memorial, and some discussion in Grenada as well. And I think it would be really important for this to happen.
I think, as well as there being kind of more of a memorialization process in the Caribbean, I also think that's necessary in the UK. So I have, I've actually looked at National Trust's sort of links to slavery report that they put out a few years ago, which sort of documented different British sort of kind of buildings and manors and kind of stately homes that have links to colonialism in one way or another. And in visiting some of these, that I sort of naturally expected, well, it's on the report. When you actually go there, there'll be monuments, there'll be signs that are explaining. But I visited quite a few of these stately homes. And in many cases, there just isn't anything there. I've had conversations with the staff members there saying, look, are you aware of X, Y, and Z? Why is it not? And that's the question, why isn't there that historical context there? And for many of the staff members, they don't know themselves. So I think the education process also has to happen here in terms of seeing the visual beneficiaries of enslavement and colonization in Britain, in institutions. I think there has to be a better job done here in the UK as well.
Oh, definitely. And I actually recently was at a National Trust property where I was hearing that there's a portrait that they want to put on display of a kind of elegant 18th century lady, and at her feet is a small child who is an enslaved African, and they want to really show that portrait, which I think is meant to have great artistic merit, but also put it in the historical context and explain why it is that she has an enslaved African child at her feet. And so I think the more that, yes, that you see that it's explained in Britain's historical fabric, then the more this process of public education continues.
It is extremely important. And you just reminded me, I got married in the past year. And when we were looking for... Thank you very much. But it's the ethical side. When you're aware of this information, you're then looking for wedding venues. One of the first venues that we considered, which we definitely didn't go with in the end, we're walking around and there's just there a picture of you know, a sort of an enslaved African at the feet, in the exact same way that you're describing, at the feet of someone who's being portrayed as a kind of lord of some kind. And I just thought, I can't get married here. You know, it's just deeply offensive, and there's no context provided at all. And I just thought to myself, how many other people from Caribbean backgrounds may want to get married and consider this as a wedding venue and may walk in this room and see that image? What effect does it have?
If it had been explained and contextualized, would you have felt that you could? No.
No, I couldn't. No, it takes me back to my childhood when I first had that realization. I remember watching Roots. I watched it all the way to the end, right until the sort of moments portrayed when he goes back to West Africa. I can't remember which country it was. I think it was, I can't remember the exact country in West Africa. I think Guinea comes to mind.
Yeah.
Where he goes to visit, you know, his ancestors, and he connects with his long lost relatives. And I remember at that point sitting by my bed, just crying, tears coming out of my mind, because I had this visualization. Well, I probably have cousins in Africa somewhere, and God knows where else. You know, what would it be like to meet them and reconnect with that lost part of my identity? So it was, I couldn't even consider a place that had a picture depicting slavery as a place to get married.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Roots, because I'm old enough that I watched it when it went out live, as it were, in Britain on the telly. And it was just so, honestly, so shocking to think that people were treated like that. That's what I remember my reaction as a child was, how could this have happened?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? And when you find out that this wasn't just a case of a few rogue pirates getting up to no good, this was,
it was an
organized, it was an industry, it was legislated, and as we know, you know, a result of that was slave owners being compensated for loss of their property, and that was obviously legislated as well. It really hits hard.
Well, just the whole idea of people as property, and how Britain, as you say, put that into legal language that then just justified all of this immorality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really.
Yeah, but this is why it's so important to kind of be aware, because I do feel like this is missing from the British education system, this history. being discussed, people being aware of it, and aware then of the legacies. Because I think one of the reasons why there is such a pushback against reparations is that for many people, they've not had this educational base to understand this. And to them, it just looks like people claiming money for something that happened a long time ago. There isn't that context that it wasn't just something, it was a deeply traumatic and painful process that took away the dignity of human beings and classified them as properties. And there are intergenerational legacies of that are still felt today.
Well, it's one of the things that I've been exploring in the podcast, Heirs of Enslavement, with Clive Lewis, because his father was part of the Windrush generation. So he left Grenada in the post-war period to come to Britain in search of work because there were no opportunities really in the West Indies, and became, very successful trade unionist, advocating for the rights of workers on the factory shop floor, and now has retired to Grenada. But I think even the Windrush generation is very poorly understood in Britain. Why people came, why Caribbean people came to Britain in the post-war period. Their contribution perhaps in building Britain is now being recognised very belatedly, along with, to some degree, the discrimination that people faced. This is being discussed. But the reason why they were there to begin with, back to Sir Hilary Beckles' point about people don't historicise their lives, which they don't. But Windrush is a legacy of slavery.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And when I think back to the experiences that my grandparents had when they first came here,
because they were generation, were they?
Yeah, so they came in 1959, actually before independence, which is weird because they had British passports, I think either for the colony or Commonwealth of Jamaica, but they didn't have a Jamaican passport because Jamaica wasn't an independent country when they came.
Right.
I didn't find that out until years later. But I've seen where my grandparents would have left. And I think the biggest thing for me is, yes, as a result of the British rule in Jamaica, there was just a complete lack of infrastructure and development opportunities. However, my family lived way up in the mountains in St. Thomas. And one thing I have to say is they could never go hungry because they were just surrounded by just fruit and vegetables and local produce that was just there. They were fairly self-sufficient in terms of what they ate. And to be able to have to leave the luxury of picking up a mango tree behind, or a jackfruit, or your dinner just from your garden, to then coming to the UK in 1959 and having to then feed over years 8 children, often with tin food. My grandparents, it was difficult for them financially, obviously marginalization, social exclusion, racism that they faced. It would have made it extremely difficult to then come here. And I just admire the resilience. But as you said, there's that context of why they made that sacrifice and that journey in the first place. And also how Britain was portrayed as a kind of metropolis for children of the empire, should we say. And then how they came here, and that wasn't quite how it turned out, was it?
No, but it's also just to hear you describe your grandparents and how they had, abundant food in Jamaica. But then if you think about it, it's the double diasporization, because their ancestors had been in Africa and had been ripped from the west coast of Africa by the slave traders and dumped in the Caribbean, where they made the best of it.
Yeah. Precisely.
But it's then the pain of that, really, from Africa to the Caribbean and then to Britain. It's poorly understood, poorly taught, and the legacies really are only just being beginning to be talked about now. But think of the pain of your grandparents, and I'm always struck by how people in the Caribbean talk about the ancestors.
Yeah, that's definitely a legacy of the kind of African traditions.
It's a powerful concept, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it is. And actually, from what little is known about the indigenous populations, which one of my relatives, unfortunately, who's now passed away, also said we have indigenous heritage as well, particularly up the mountains where many of the indigenous people escaped to, and they mixed with the Africans, and they, in some cases, showed them how to use the land. Their role is also kind of misunderstood and sometimes hardly recorded in history at all. But for what little is known about their traditions, they also have concepts around ancestors as well, being really important to kind of understanding and spirituality, forms of identity as well. So there is that additional layer as well. We often forget, we remind ourselves that there was an indigenous population in the Caribbean as well, and they were impacted too.
Yes, and that's something that I really know so little about and want to learn more about, the legacies of that.
Absolutely. We'll bring the interview to a close, but I just want you to share any kind of reading materials that you'd recommend, or documentaries that you'd recommend for people to learn more about this information.
Well, I will say that Professor Sir Hilary Beckles' books are really, I know you've read them, James, but he has a trio which are short, brilliantly written, will tell you everything that you need to know. I would highly recommend Britain's Black Debt by Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean, and then also his book about Barbados, Britain's First Slave Society, which really is just chilling for people who think of Barbados as a tourist paradise. You really have to read that and understand how it was ground zero in a way for where Britain wrote its slave code that was then exported across the Caribbean. And I think if you read those three books, I would also, of course, recommend Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, written in 1944, but still a key text in terms of outlining the case for reparations. But those are the books that I would recommend anyone who's interested in this subject should read.
Thank you. And finally, how can people get in contact with you?
You can get in contact with me. LinkedIn's quite a good way, actually. I find that LinkedIn's quite useful. Or you could also send me a direct message on X, as it's now called. Those are good ways.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Laura. This will be published online. So any comments, any feedback, please leave them in the comment section below. Laura, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, James. It was an honor and a privilege, and good luck with your important work.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.